everyone. In the last class, we discussed about types of policy analysis, okay, and we discussed about 4 different types of policy analysis. So today we'll be discussing the process of policy analysis, okay. So here we will be discussing what are the core questions that we need to get the answer for policy analysis, along with what are the methodology that we take into account. So highlighting the policy analytic methods that we will be discussing, and how do we prescribe a particular policy, okay. So what are the criteria for that? So all these would be discussed in this class. So coming to the process of analysis, we understand that this process of policy analysis is a very systematic and multi-step approach that are used to evaluate the potential causes of actions that needs to be solved, or that needs to solve the societal issues, okay. So that is what is known as the process of policy analysis. It is a multi-step approach, okay, and it is very systematic, okay. So given this understanding, now we need to understand that in this process, what are the processes that are likely to be involved in this policy analysis, okay. So for that reason, we need to collect policy relevant information about 5 core questions, okay. So these are the 5 core questions that is mentioned here. So the first one is policy problems. So basically in policy problems, we try to understand that what exactly is the issue that the society is facing, and for which the society is seeking the intervention from the government side for getting a solution, okay. And once that problem is identified, or policy problem is identified, the next process, right, or the next kind of set of information that needs to be understood is in terms of expected policy outcomes, okay. So let's say that during this policy problems, we identify what are the challenges that the society is facing, and how the government can interfere or intervene in solving the societal issues, okay. So in providing potential solutions for those problems that the society is facing, okay. So once that is done, the second step is what are the expected policy outcomes, okay. So because when we say that expected policy outcomes, that for this particular problem that we are considering, so there should be a targeted policy, and the targeted policy is not even implemented, right. Rather, here we are thinking about what are the expected qualities, right, or attributes that should be there, so that the particular policy can be implemented. So for that thing, we need to understand what are the expected outcomes and outputs that the said policy should be having, right, so that we can address the societal issues that is being faced, okay. So in expected policy outcomes, we need to get information related to the expected outcomes of the policies that are designed by the government as a potential solution for the challenges that the society is facing, okay. So once these information are created, these informations are collected, right. So next one that we need to understand in as a part of your process of policy analysis process is the preferred policies, because here we already discuss, right, or forecasted that what are the likely outcomes that the said policy or alternative policies are going to generate, right, as a potential solution to the societal problem, okay. So out of all these alternatives, let's say there are 3 alternatives, A, B and C, right. We need to identify which are or which would be the preferred policy for addressing the societal challenge, okay. So that means out of these 3 alternatives, right, after understanding or after appraising in terms of benefit cost, in terms of different parameters, that what are the expected policy outcomes by the first alternative, second alternative and third alternative, we need to take a decision regarding the preferred policy, that which one is to be taken, right. So here we are creating enough information to be in a position to take a decision that which policy should be chosen. So once this one is completed, we need to understand the observed policy outcomes. Okay, so what is this observed policy outcomes? So here we have already identified that out of this alternative, which policy is going to be chosen, that means going to be implemented. Okay, so let's say that policy A is chosen and policy A is implemented, right? So after the implementation of the policy, the next process, right, that we need to follow as a part of policy analysis is the actual outcomes of that said policy after the implementation. So here the expected policy outcome is the ex ante analysis, right, creation of information for ex ante analysis. But for this observed policy outcomes, it is the creation of or collection of information for after the implementation of the policy. So that is the ex post policy information. Okay, so that means after the implementation of the policy, what are the attributes and what are the informations that are collected, so that we can find that what policy outcomes are observed after the implementation. Okay, so once this is done, then the next process that also needs to be analyzed as a part of your policy analysis is policy performances. So in policy performances, generally we ask the question to what extent the actual observed policy outcomes contribute for the solution of that particular societal challenge. Okay, so so all these 5 questions needs to be discussed in detail, right? So we'll be discussing all these process of policy analysis one by one. Let's move to the first one, that as I told you that in policy problems, okay, so we are more concerned about the question that what is the problem for which the potential solution is sought, right? So here in answering this question, right, so or at this stage we need to identify that the policy problem needs to be defined precisely, right? And this policy problem is said to be unrealized needs or unrealized opportunities, right, that the society is seeking, right, or that the society is demanding for the action, governmental action. Okay, and in this case, in defining these policy problems, so if we are facing inadequate information or misleading information or faulty information, right, at this initial stage, okay, so then it may be it may prove a very fatal factor, right, in the policy aspects. Okay, so that means here the problem is that because of inadequate policy information or because of the wrong information regarding this policy, identification of policy or policy problems, so we are defining a wrong problem. Okay, so defining a wrong problem is a challenge and it can result in fatal error in the policy decisions. Okay, so in this context we can say that when the policy problem is defined wrongly, right, so in that case we are committing a type of error which is known as the type 3 error. Okay, so what is this type 3 error we'll be discussing, but before that perhaps I'm just helping you to understand that there are at least 4 types of errors that we are facing or that we are discussing in statistics in hypothesis testing chapter, right? And the more pronounced or more common discussion that we have in type of errors is type 1 and type 2. So that means type 1 and type 2 errors are very common errors, are commonly discussed in standard textbooks, but type 3 and type 4 needs to be discussed at length so far the policy aspects is concerned. So here my point is that when there is inadequacy of information or there is wrong information provided, right, in the initial stage of identification of problem, so we are committing a particular error and that error is known as the type 3 error. Okay, so what is this type 1 error and what is type 2 error and what is type 3 error, right? So that we need to discuss. So for example, first of all I will be giving an example, then it would be easier on our part to understand that what exactly is this type 3 error. Okay, so coming to the first one, that is type 1 error. Okay, So what is this type 1 error? All of us are acquainted with this type 1 error. I am just going to brief it, and then we will be discussing the type 3. Okay. So in hypothesis testing chapter, we have already, many of us have already gone through this, that suppose say we have to take a decision, right, and the null hypothesis is already framed, right, null hypothesis is already framed, so that is H0. Okay. So now we are going to take a decision. Okay. So here we have this null hypothesis, that is the null hypothesis can be false, right, or null hypothesis can be true. Okay. And here we are taking a decision, here. So decision can be either accepting the null hypothesis or rejecting the null hypothesis. So let's say it is rejecting the null hypothesis and here accepting the null hypothesis. Okay. Now check. So here we are facing a case that when our null hypothesis is false and we are rejecting the null hypothesis, that means our decision is correct, right? So we are taking a right decision or correct decision. Okay. So this is our correct decision taken. So what is the combination? What is the situation? The situation is that when the null hypothesis is false and we are rejecting the null hypothesis, that means we are deciding that the null hypothesis should be rejected, then so that case or that combination gives us the correct decision. Okay. So let's say we can take another one, that is your null hypothesis is true, right, but however we are deciding to reject the null hypothesis. What is the condition? The condition is that null hypothesis is correct, null hypothesis is true, but we are rejecting the null hypothesis. Okay. So it is not correct, decision is not correct, that means we are committing an error, right? So that error is known as the type 1 error. Okay. So when do you find the type 1 error? The type 1 error is found when the null hypothesis is true, but we are rejecting the null hypothesis. So then we are finding a case that is type 1 error. We are committing an error that is known as the type 1 error. Okay. So now we can move to this the next case. The next case is that when the null hypothesis is true and we are accepting the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is true, but and we are accepting the null hypothesis. So then it is correct one, because the hypothesis is correct, right, and we are accepting it, then of course the decision is correct. So we are taking a correct decision. Okay. So we are taking a correct decision here, we are taking a correct decision here. Okay. And we are moving to the fourth case, that when the null hypothesis is false, right, but we are accepting the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is false and we are accepting the null hypothesis, that means it is not correct. So that means we are committing an error, and that error is known as the type 2 error. Got it? What is type 1 error and type 2 error? So in case of type 1 error, we are facing this situation that the null hypothesis is true, but we are rejecting it. As a result, we are committing an error, that is type 1 error, right? And in type 2 error, the null hypothesis is false, but however we are accepting the null hypothesis. So as a result, we are committing an error, and that error is known as the type 2 error. Okay. So now perhaps we understood what is this type 1 and type 2 error. Okay. So basically in case of type 1 error, we reject a null hypothesis that is actually true, and in case of type 2 error, we are accepting a null hypothesis when it is false, right? But in case of type 3 error, we are providing a right answer to a wrong question or to a wrong hypothesis. Okay. Okay. So that means we are rejecting the null hypothesis for a wrong reason. Okay. So in this case, basically we can say that type 3 error will be committed in case of wrong model, right, but with a right answer. When we are having a wrong model, but we are answering correctly, right, with a right answer, then it is the case of the type 3 error. Okay. So, perhaps you will be thinking about some of the examples, but before moving to the examples, I just want to highlight this, that when we are defining the problem wrongly, then we are facing an error, that is type 3 error, okay, which is different from type 1 error and type 2 error. Okay. So, again I am just trying to remind you that in case of type 1 error, right, or type 1 error is committed when the level of statistical significance, that is usually denoted by this symbol alpha, so that is set very high, right, that is set at very high level. Okay. So perhaps you might have gone through with the concept, that is level of statistical significance level denoted by alpha. Okay. So what is this alpha? Alpha is denoted sometimes at 5%, that means 0.05, okay, level, and sometimes we are also comparing this our result with this alpha, that is statistical significance, that is a statistical level of significance at 1%, that is 0.01. Okay. So what is this 5% and what is this 1%? So perhaps again we can say that when we are using this statistics 5% and 1%, okay, so we are saying that in case of type 1 error, right, the alpha is set at a higher level. Let's say alpha is set at 5%, that is 0.05, okay, and your p value, the probable value, right, is 0.04. Okay. So what would be happening? So we are finding that this alpha is greater than p value, right. So as a result, what would be the decision? The decision is reject the null hypothesis even when it is true. Okay. So rejecting null hypothesis even when it is true because of these conditions. Okay. So that is what we are finding, that at the level of 5% significance we are rejecting the null hypothesis. Okay. And the condition is that when p value is less than L alpha value, right, we reject the null hypothesis. Okay. Otherwise we have to accept the null hypothesis. Okay. So given this understanding, now we can give some examples of type 3 error, right, and the type 3 error, as I told you, that can happen, right, when we are rejecting a wrong null hypothesis, okay, or when your null hypothesis is not properly framed or completely correct, right. So in those situations, this type 3 error can be created. Okay. So for better understanding, I think we can take an example that would be more clear. So suppose say there is a software industry, okay, and that software industry or that particular software company, let's say, it wants to check the reliability of two different servers, X server and Y server. Okay. So there are two servers, X and Y, right, possessed by that particular software company. Okay. And they just want to check the reliability of these two servers between X and Y, that which one would be more reliable for their company. Okay. So for that, of course, they would be running a hypothesis test. The company now conclude that, let's say, X is statistically more reliable than the server Y. Okay. So what is the case? That X is proved to be more reliable than Y. Okay. So here we are committing an error that is known as the type 3 error. Why it is so? Because both the servers X and Y are highly prone to crash. That means both the server can be crashed. So both are prone to crash. Okay. So it is a wrong question. It is a wrong question that which one is reliable, X and Y, right? Because both the servers are prone to crash. So we framed a wrong question. Okay. And the wrong question is that we put this which one is more reliable, right? So instead of putting this question, the more appropriate question could be, or the right way the question should be framed like this, that do either of the servers meet the minimum standards, that is 99 point, let's say 99.9 uptime requirement. Okay, so if that could be the question, then the answer could be right. But here the procedure and answers are correctly given, but the question is wrong, right? So the question is wrong, the answer is right. Okay, so that is known as the type 3 error. And in case of wrongly framed questions, right, or if the information that is required for framing the policy problems, okay, are inadequate, so then this type 3 errors can be committed. Okay, and the second aspect that I also like to highlight is that it is not the case of a single policy question, that how type 3 errors are committed. We can also take some numericals, right, at least one numerical, to understand that how this type 3 errors are occurring, right? So for example, it is not only the case that the problems are wrongly or inadequately framed. So this type 3 error can also occur due to mischaracterization or mischaracterizing the difference, we can say, mischaracterization of the direction of the effect. Okay, so that means different direction of the effect. So that means we can take the example that how this particular problem can create type 3 error. Okay, so let's assume a clinical trial test. Okay, so what is that clinical trial test about? The clinical trial test is all about a new drug. Okay, so before the launch of a drug, the clinically the drug is tried, right? And we are assuming that a clinical trial test occurred regarding new cholesterol medications against a placebo. Okay, placebo means it is a false one, but it is treated as if it is working. Okay, so the null hypothesis that is developed is that the drug has no effect on in controlling cholesterol. Okay, so that means we have to say that the mean difference would be 0, right? And in case of, if you observe the true population, then we will be finding the medication actually lowers the cholesterol level, right? Let's say that cholesterol level has gone down by an average of 20 mg by dl. Okay, so the cholesterol level will be lower down by 20 mg, right? Okay, so that means it is observed to be effective, right? Because of this drug, right? When a person is medicated by using this drug, then the cholesterol level is going down. Okay, so in this case, what is the direction? The direction is that when there is an intervention, or when this particular intervention in terms of this drug is intervened, okay, so as a result the cholesterol is going down. Okay, so that means we are finding a negative relationship. Okay, so when it is intervened, so this is going down. Okay, so since we found that if the drug lowers down the cholesterol level, so the data analyst will run a one-tailed test. Okay, not two-tailed test, rather one-tailed test. Okay, so that means in case of this, since it is reducing, so that means the analyst would be preferring to run a left tail test, right, in order to find the significance level, right? And as it for this to find whether it is significant or not, so the researcher would again be setting a significant level. Let's say that alpha is rated as 5%, that is 0.05 level. Okay, and as a result the data yield in this case, right, when we will be doing it, then let's say that data yields a very low p level, let's say it is 0.04. Okay, so what would be the case? So now the case is that this p value is less than this alpha. So when p value is less than the alpha, then what do we do? So we reject the null hypothesis, right? What is the null hypothesis? You can remember the null hypothesis was that the drug has no effect in controlling cholesterol level by in case of in the human body. Okay, so but yeah, so because this p level is less than level of significance, statistical level of significance, that is the reason we are rejecting the null hypothesis, and we are saying that the drug has no effect in controlling the cholesterol level. Okay, so this is happening because of directional flaw. Okay, so what is the directional flaw? So we have already found here. So we found that, so when this particular medication is when a person is getting this medicine, right, so as a result the cholesterol level is getting down. So that is the reason for this, for the for the statistical significance. So the researcher has taken this left tailed test. Okay, okay, so that is the reason we are finding that although by observation we are finding that it is effective, the drug is effective, right, in controlling the cholesterol level, but however the statistical tests show that we need to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so what is the meaning of rejecting the null hypothesis? The meaning of rejecting the null hypothesis is that there is no effect of this drug in controlling the cholesterol, which is in contrast to our observation. Okay, got the case? So that means our observation is saying something, and through the statistical test we are finding something. So this is a case of type 3 error, right? So as I told you that type 3 error can happen because of this lack of information or inadequate of information. It can also occur because of this directional flaw also, right? So as a result we need to be very careful about, okay, about this type 3 error, and the policy problems must be identified, must be framed in such a way that maximum amount of information must be collected in this stage for the proper development or proper framing of the policy problem. Okay, so once this stage is done, then the next step is expected policy outcomes, and generally in this case we try to get the answer of the question that what are the expected outcomes of the policies that are designed, because the case is that this is the policy is not implemented, rather it is in the development stage. Okay, so that is the reason before the implementation of the policies we are the analyst is forecasting that what are the likely outcomes the policy will generate if it is going to be implemented. Okay, so the expected policy outcomes are are the likely consequences of the alternative policy that are designed to solve the societal problem. Okay, so again we have to think about the information that is going to be generated and collected in this process, because more the information that is created about the expected policy, it will be utilized in the latter stage as well. And such kind of information sometimes are very insufficient, right, because there is lack of data collections, and also the case that the past does not repeat itself completely, and the values shape behavior may change in the future as well. So as a result we may have a very insufficient information at this stage as well. Okay, so next stage is preferred policies, that out of all the alternative policies that is expected, okay, or that the outcomes of the policies that are expected from the alternative policies that we are thinking about, so which one would be the best one, which one would be the preferred one? So the question that is asked here to decide which policies should be chosen, okay, that would be treated as a preferred policies. Okay, and and for selecting the preferred policy some of the informations are expected. For example, expected policy outcomes. Okay, so expected policy outcomes from X alternative, Y alternatives, and Z alternatives. So all the information are collected about these three. Not only this, we also need to discuss about what are the utility of this expected policy from these three alternatives. So based in this comparison, we take into account what is the preferred policy, okay, that is chosen or that needs to be chosen. Again, when this step is completed, we move to the next step, that is observed policy outcomes. So here we discuss about the expected policy outcomes. That means policy is not implemented, okay, but we are forecasting what could be the likely policy outcomes if the policy is getting implemented. And here we are trying to identify what are the actual policy outcomes after the implementation, okay. So this object policy outcome can happen at the present, okay. We need to take into account the consequences that we are finding at present, or even the consequences that were already identified in the past for the implementing a preferred policy needs to be taken into account, okay. And many times we are observing that these social outcomes are the result of the outcomes that the society is getting are the results of some other factors, okay. So it may be the case that the outcomes that we are finding, right, after the implementation, it may not be because of that particular policy, rather it is because of some of the other factors or extra policy factors, okay. So in that case, it is very essential to know what are the causal relationship or cause and consequences of the societal outcomes that we are finding, okay. So the consequence of the action cannot be fully stated, or sometimes the consequences of the action cannot be also known in advance, okay. It is very difficult even to capture the projected consequences, which means that there could be many consequences, right, which are neither anticipated or intended, okay. So they could be they are known as unanticipated outcomes or unintended outcomes, okay. And moving to the next one regarding the policy performance, because we have already discussed about the observed policy outcomes, that what are the policy outcomes actually happening, okay. So once those information are collected, we will be in a position to discuss about the policy performances. So policy performances can be understood by posing this question, that to what extent do the observed policy outcomes contribute in the sense that in satisfying the goals that we have already set, right, for solving the problems that we are discussing about, okay. So policy performances can be defined as the degree to which the observed policy outcomes contribute to the solution of a particular problem, okay. And if you see in practice, or the actual governance practice, then we are finding that this policy performance is never perfect, okay. Policy performance is never perfect, right. Why? Because there are problems that are rarely solved, okay. So the reasons are many, right. So the policy performance is never perfect. It is because of many things, because of our forecast, because of our inadequacy of the information, okay. And most often we are finding that the public problems are reformulated, sometimes it is remaining unsolved. So as a result, it is leading, or it is helpful in evaluating that if the said policy should be continued, should be adopted, or should be continued, or should be halted together, or even terminated. So based on these policy performance only, okay. So now we can discuss about from all these steps that we discussed right now as a part of policy analysis can be understood here. So we have already identified and framed the policy problems, okay. So for those policy problems, we identified the problems, and also we developed some of the befitting policy alternatives, okay. So as I told you that we already developed 3 different policy alternatives, and we try to forecast that what are the likely outcomes if X alternative is implemented for solving the policy problem that we framed here. What and the second is also, we also try to find out that what are the expected outcomes by the second alternative and also the third alternatives, okay. So this we are projecting, right, or we are forecasting the outcomes if these and these policies are going to be implemented. Okay, so this is ex ante outcomes from these policy alternatives. Okay, so once we are done with this, then we have to choose that what is the best or preferred alternative, right, or preferred policy out of all the alternatives. Okay, so we already collected through the forecasting, right, we already collected the variables or information related to all these, and finally we decide upon or we choose what is the best or what is the preferred policy out of all these alternatives. Okay, so that would be the prescriptions for the preferred policies. Okay, so once preferred policies would be decided, then of course it would be the actual policy which can be implemented. Okay, so during this implementation we need monitoring. Again, we will be generating data during this monitoring, and which will be helpful in furthering the process of this policy. And here, after this monitoring, right, so we'll be generating or we'll be finding the observations and information about the observed outcomes, not expected outcomes. So here it is expected outcomes and here it is observed outcomes. Okay, what is the actual outcomes if after the implementation of the preferred policy. So here we can find another arrow going here, that from the observed outcomes we can get the data and information for evaluation. Okay, right, and those information can also be helpful in projecting, in forecasting and getting the expected outcomes of the policies that we discussed here. Okay, so again, after getting the information in terms of object outcomes, then it would be again be utilized in the structuring of the problems or policy problems. Okay, and it takes a circular frame. Okay, so given this understanding, now we can move to discuss about the major methodology of policy analysis. So what is this methodology? Methodology is a systematic, it is a systematic framework, right, to understand not only the products of the policy inquiry but also the processes that are employed to create these products. Okay, and if you see the methodology of a policy analysis, it is not constrained by any of the disciplinary boundary or disciplinary doctrine. Rather, it is methodologically very pluralist. Okay, so it can drag the tools and theories and models from different academic disciplines. Okay, and the practitioners are very free to decide upon that which method or which theory or which models are going to be used in policy analysis. Okay, so given this understanding, now we can discuss about this policy analytic methods. Okay, so since we understand that this analytic methods are borrowed from different branches and different academic disciplines. Okay, but all these methods would be involving judgments, and these judgments would be of different kinds. So suppose say that the judgments can be in terms of whether to accept or whether to reject a particular explanation. It can be in terms of whether to prescribe or whether not to prescribe a particular policy. It can be in terms of affirming or dispute the rightness of an action. Okay, so all these would be the judgments, right, the judgments behind the methods. Okay, so these methods serve as the operational tools. Okay, and these operational tools can be used to convert one form of policy information to another from throughout the integrated policy analysis loop. Okay, so in policy analysis we can think that the procedure means how we are converting one form of policy information into another. So this is the procedure. So this procedure can have specialized names like policy structuring. Sometimes we also know it as forecasting, right, or somewhere it is also known as the prescription, monitoring and evaluation. So all these are the procedures, right, that we are giving. So when we convert one form of policy information to another form, so for everything, as I told you, these procedures have special names like problem structuring, right, or we are saying prescription, monitoring and evaluation. So what exactly are these? So problem structuring means, as I told you, that problem structuring is a kind of method that are employed to produce information about which problem to solve, because there are many problems. Out of many problems, which problem is to be solved. Okay, so the problem structuring, this is a method which is employed to produce information about which problem is to be solved. Okay, and this particular method is assisted by different aspects like assumptions, or identifying the causes and mapping the possible objectives, or sometimes we also take into account visualization method, discovering and deciding the new policy options. So all these are the assisting factors to this method, that is problem structuring method. Okay, and this problem structuring method is the central guidance systems, okay, of the policy analysis, which are used for testing different representations in different troubled situations as well. So this is how we can say this is a method which is helpful in policy analysis. The second one is the forecasting. Okay, so as I told you that forecasting is not the real one, it is not the real data or information, rather it is the predicted data, right? So forecasting methods are used to produce the information that are expected from the policy outcomes, okay, given the data set. Okay, and when we do this forecasting, because it is not real, rather it is the predicted ones, right? So the forecasting can also be helpful in estimating the consequences of the existing and sometimes the newly advocated policies or newly proposed policies, right? And it specifies the future constraints on the achievement of a particular objective, or it can also estimate the feasibility, basically the political feasibility of different alternatives that we are taking into account. Okay, so by doing this forecasting, it allows the policy analyst to project what are the likely consequences of one or more alternatives that we have already taken into account for their implementation. Okay, so forecasting is the ex ante information, right? Or it provides ex ante information that are necessary to guide the choice between different sources of actions that need to be taken into account for that policy concerns. Okay, so the next one would be prescription. What is prescription? That means creating information. Okay, prescription, again, it is a method. Okay, so this method of prescription is generally employed to generate or to create information about the choicest policies or about the preferred policies among all the alternatives. Okay, so here the analysts try to estimate what are the risk, level of risk and uncertainty there, and also identify that if at all there is some kind of unidentified, right, unidentified or unintended consequences, by identifying the externalities and spillovers, and also specifying the criteria for choice making, right, and assigning the administrative responsibilities for the implementation of the said policies. and and this prescription method also tries to answer the very fundamental question, what is that what should be done by identifying which alternative maximizes the best utility, sorry, maximizing the utility or the benefits. Okay, the fourth method is the monitoring method. That means here it tries to produce the information about the policy outcomes, right, observed policy outcomes, because this monitoring happens on actual implementation of the policies. So it tries to produce information about the observed policy outcomes, and it also provides information about consequences of adopting policies and assisting in policy implementation phase. Okay, so basically during monitoring, it investigates whether a policy is causally what you can say related to the outcome, and identify if other factors are also responsible for the consequences. Okay, so basically the causal relationship, establishment of causal relationship is also identified over here. So this particular method of monitoring provides ex post data, right, in contrast to the ex ante data that we have already discussed about. And the last stage the last method that we usually talk about is evaluation method, and the target of this evaluation method is to produce again the information about the utility or the value of the policy outcomes, that is observed policy outcomes, and their contribution to the policy performances. So basically it determines the extent to which the observed outcomes contribute to the original opportunity for improvement and that give rise to a particular problem. Okay, and if you see all these policy analytic method, there are 5 policy analytic method that we discussed here, and all these policy analytic method are very interdependent. We cannot imagine one method without the predecessor. So it is not possible to use one method without first having used the others. Okay, so and again to select a preferred policy, it requires lot of information, right? It requires that the analysts have already monitored, evaluated and forecasted the policy outcomes. Okay, so given this understanding, now we need to understand what are the criteria that are followed for prescribing a particular preferred policy. Okay, so when you say that what are the criteria that are used for policy prescription, it means we have to take into this criteria can be in terms of stated rules or principles or standards that are used to justify the policy choices. Okay, and basically we are using 6 different types of criteria for choosing or prescribing the preferred policy. So effectiveness, efficiency, adequacy, equity, responsiveness and appropriateness. Okay, so although we have already discussed effectiveness in previous class, so I am just trying to highlight what and remind what exactly here, what exactly the meaning of effectiveness in this policy context. So effectiveness refers to the principle that an alternative should promote the achievement of valued outcome of an action, right? And if the alternative is satisfying the policy goals, then it becomes effective. So effectiveness is measured in terms of units of products or units of services, and also they are also in terms of their monetary units. Okay, so for example, an effective health policy is one that provides more quality health care to more people, more quality health care, right, in terms of products and service. So it is a service, more quality health care, okay, to more people. Okay, so that is what is your effectiveness of policy. And coming to the efficiency, another criteria for the preferred policy is the efficiency. Again, as I told you that if the society is getting maximum amount of well-being, right, or well-being is maximized, then we are saying it is efficient. So efficiency here refers to the amount of effort that is required to produce a given level of effectiveness. Okay, because effectiveness is now more or less standard or fixed. Okay, so we have to find out what amount of effort is required for achieving this effectiveness. So it is the relationship between effectiveness and efforts. Okay, so the efficiency can be determined by calculating what are the costs required per unit of the products or services that the society is requiring, right? Or by calculating the total monetary benefits, that is for example per gallon of irrigation water, okay, less the cost per gallon of this water in order to find out the net monetary benefits. So policies are chosen based on this criteria, that the policies that achieve the higher net benefits per unit cost are said to be the efficient one, and accordingly the preferred policy should have this criteria, should fulfill this criteria. So another criteria is adequacy. Adequacy is the extent to which any given level of effectiveness satisfy the particular standard, right? So the criteria of adequacy specifies the expectation about the strength of a particular relationship between the policy alternatives and a fixed and variable value of the desired outcome. Okay, so basically we can say that the criteria of adequacy can be understood in terms of 4 types of problems. Okay, so type 1 problem, type 2, type 3 and type 4. So So if you mention about the type 1 problem, right? So here we can find that the policies are having the policies, those who are spending equal cost, right, and producing different effectiveness. Okay, so that is type 1 problem of adequacy. So equal cost but different effectiveness. Okay, so type 2. So if you see the type 2 problems, so the type 2 problems are the equal effectiveness, but the costs are different. Okay, so equal effectiveness is the type 2 one. So the type 3 problems are, again you can see that if the costs are variable, right, and the effectiveness are also variable, then the type 3 problems of adequacy would be created. Again, for type 4, we can find that costs are equal and effectiveness are also equal, so it is equal cost and equal effectiveness problem that we are finding in case of the criteria of adequacy. So let's understand that whether all these problems are real life problems or all these are theoretical. Okay, so coming to the problem 1. So what is this problem 1? So we are finding that equal cost and the effectiveness is variable. Okay, so problem of this type 1 involve equal cost but the effectiveness is variable. Okay, so what is the real life example? So the real life example is about the budgetary expenditures that the union governments and the state governments are getting. Okay, so what is the target? The target is maximum allowable budgetary expenditures. Okay, and it will be resulting in, of course, the fixed cost, and the target is to maximize effectiveness. Okay, within the limits of the available resources or in terms of the budgetary expenditure. Okay, so this is a case of, this is a response to our type 1 problems, right? Because equal cost analysis would be there, and because analysts would be comparing alternatives and also varying in effectiveness. But the so far the cost aspects are concerned, the cost aspects are equal. So this is a case of our equal cost and variable effectiveness in the budgetary expenditures. Okay, and if you see the most adequate policy, then we can consider those policy as the most adequate policy, right, which can maximize the attainment of the objectives while remaining within the limits of the budgets or within the limits of the cost. Okay, coming to the second one, that is type 2 problem. Okay, what is this type 2 problem? If you can remember, it has two features, right? So the first one is equal effectiveness but with variable cost. Okay, so that means equal effectiveness and variable cost, it means it tries to minimize the cost, right, since the effectiveness is equal, right, and the cost is variable, then of course the target is to minimize cost for attaining the equal effectiveness. Okay, so example, again we can think about the public transportation facilities. Okay, and if the public transportation facilities must serve at least a target number or target population of, let's say, 1 lakh population annually, so the problem is to identify those alternative transportation system or facilities like buses, trains, subways, and etc., so that will achieve the fixed level of effectiveness at least cost. Okay, so effectiveness is constant here, that it will be served, so these facilities will serve this 1 lakh people, right, but the cost would be different, but because the cost for bus would be different from the cost for the subways and like that. So this is a case of type 2 problem when we are thinking about creation of public transportation facilities. So here the most adequate policy would be one that minimizes the cost while achieving the fixed level of its effectiveness. Okay, and the third type 3 problems will be occurring when it satisfies the two attributes, that it involves the variable cost and the effectiveness is also variable. Okay, so for example, we can take the example of our budget, optimal budget. Okay, so the choice of an optimal budget is to maximize the attainment of the agency's objectives. Okay, so that would be a type 3 problem. And if you see the response, the kind of response to this type 3 problems, So it is called variable cost and variable effectiveness analysis, because cost and effectiveness are allowed to vary. Okay, so that is the reason we are finding this variable cost and variable effectiveness. Okay, so in this case the policy can maximize the ratio of effectiveness to the cost, right? And that is considered to be most adequate. Okay, so the last criteria for adequacy is type 4 adequacy. So it advocates or involves about equal cost as well as equal effectiveness. Okay, so here the data analysis are not only limited by the requirement of the cost, because the cost is equal and also the effectiveness is equal, right? So here we are taking the example of a type 4 problem, that again we are considering the case of public transportation facilities. Okay, so the target is or effectiveness is for 1 lakh people. Okay, 1 lakh persons annually, and the costs have been fixed. That is the reason we are saying equal cost, right? Effectiveness is also fixed, that the service generated should be meeting the demand of 1 lakh population. So when you are saying that effectiveness is fixed and we are fixing the cost, right? So it seems unrealistic level, right? Then any policy alternative that we are thinking must either satisfy both the constraint, or they can be rejected. Okay, so in this situation the only remaining alternative is don't do anything, right? Because your costs are fixed and effectiveness is fixed. Okay, so and we are thinking about, in order to meet this effectiveness, right, so we are fixing the cost. Okay, so as a result, what would be the only situation that we can think about is don't do anything, or satisfy both the constraint, or reject both the constraint. Okay, so coming to the last one, second last, after adequacy we have, we have equity. This is the last one, last criteria. So it refers to the distribution of the effects and efforts among different sections of the society. Okay, so how effects and efforts are distributed among different sections of the society, and we are requiring an equitable policy. Okay, or an equitable policy can be one for which the effects in terms of, let's say, products or services, or in terms of monetary benefits, or efforts maybe in terms of monetary costs, so they are fairly and justly distributed among different sections of the society. Okay, so then, so all these criteria are taken into account for the preferred policy. Okay, so for you can refer, for this section you can refer to chapter 1 and chapter 5 of this book. Thank you very much.